Howdy folks, and welcome to another exciting edition of Random Jank. Now, the last few weeks I've been talking about the guilds of Ravnica. Thank God I'm already done with that. I'm really sorry it took so long, but I want to go into detail with everything that was available to me at the time. This week, I'm actually going to be talking about something I kind of went into a little bit of detail a few weeks ago, but not completely. Multiplayer formats, specifically EDH. It was a really big thing, and I didn't really have enough time to go into a lot of detail. So not only am I going to be telling you people how to make a general idea of what an EDH deck could be, I'm going to be using some examples of my own EDH deck. We're going to start off with what EDH is. Now, it's a deck that has 100 cards in it, 99 single copy cards with the exception of your basic lands, and one of them which has to be a legendary creature. Now, my legendary creature is Grimgrin the Corpseborn. I love the ability, I love the fact that it's a 5/5 for 5, and it allows for a lot of different interactions, especially with the deck that I'm about to show you. The key thing that you want to remember with EDH is that you can only use the colors that your general has. Now, Grimgrin is blue and black. I love blue and black. There's a lot of card draw and a lot of different tutoring abilities, which helps you get to those cards faster, especially when you only have one copy of any given card at a time. Those two colors are really good at finding the cards that you need. Now, with 99 cards that you have to build a deck with, you kind of have to build your mana base right away. And what I generally use as a rule of thumb is about a third of the deck is going to be lands. It really depends on how high cost your cards are, but in a format like EDH, you actually have the opportunity to cast a lot of big stuff because the game's going to be going on for a long time. You're going to have at least 4 people there in multiple turns all across the board. You're going to have a lot of mana to actually spend on cards that you might be interested in but haven't actually found a use for in your standard or other format decks. Once you have about 33 to about 37 lands in your deck, you want to start thinking about what your deck does. Now, the important thing to remember, like I said before, you can only use one copy of any given card. But that's not actually to say that you can't use the exact same effect. Take, for example, Evolving Wilds. Now, Evolving Wilds, you put it on the field as one of your lands, you tap it and sacrifice it to search your deck for another basic land and put that into play tapped. Now, Evolving Wilds is one, but there's also Terramorphic Expanse, which does the exact same thing. But because it has a different name, it actually counts as a different card. So you can include that in your deck as well. And that's a really key thing that you want to look for. You want to look for cards that have very similar abilities so that your deck has a little bit more consistency than just a random collection of 99 cards that you thought were fun. Now, on top of having multiple cards with very similar abilities, like any deck that you build, you want to have an overarching theme. Now, an EDH deck allows for a lot of creativity, and you have the ability to make a lot of different things work at the same time, but you still want to limit it to as few things as possible and all things working together in a very synergistic way. You want to be able to have one overarching theme. Now, with Grimgrin, I decided to go Zombie Tribal Mill. Now, every single creature in my deck is going to be a zombie, so it has nothing but zombies in there whatsoever. And most of those creatures have a way of triggering something for your opponent to take the top card of his library and put it into his grave right away. I love Mill. It's an excellent win condition, alternate win condition, as opposed to just flatlining your opponent with damage. And I always love taking away your opponent's options instead of having to worry about it yourself. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of basics is tutors. Now, like I said before, Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, those are land tutors, but you don't want to just search out your lands and filter through your deck that way. You want to actually look for specific cards. Considering how big your deck is, you're not going to always get the exact same cards that you need when you need it. So you use cards like tutors, and in my particular colors, there are some very excellent tutors that you can use, specifically Demonic and Diabolic Tutor, which allow you to search for any card and put it directly into your hand. There's also Increasing Ambition, which I've used to great effect, not only because it has it's only one more than your typical tutor, but then you can also flashback it as well, so you get 2 uses out of the same card. And I actually just discovered it's an old card, but I just recently discovered it. Parallel Thoughts. Now, it's exactly like all the other tutors, with a few key differences. As you're searching through your deck, instead of just searching for one card, you're searching for 7. So you have, for example, your field is pretty much full with everything except for a few key pieces, and you don't need any more lands, and you don't need to basically search for anything else except for a few key elements to really complete your board presence and make sure that your opponents can't do anything anymore. So you use Parallel Thoughts, you get those few elements that you need, total of 7, you actually get to make a separate draw pile. And the key word here is that anytime that you have the ability to draw a card at all, instead of drawing from your library, you can draw from this 7 pack of tutored cards that you want. Now, a really sneaky thing that you can do with this is mill yourself out completely. And then anytime that you have to draw a card, instead of drawing a card from your library, you can draw from this pile. And even if you have no cards left, you no longer can lose by not being able to draw a card anymore. It's very sneaky, and I'm looking forward to a time when I can use that with a lot more consistency. So we've talked about cards that will help you get the cards that you need out right away. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about your mana base, not just the numbers, specifically what land cards that you want, because if you're just loading your deck up with just a bunch of basic lands, you're not necessarily going to hit the number of colors that you're going to need at the same time as you need them, which is why there's a bunch of dual lands out there that you can use, or even multicolor lands, but for this particular deck we're only going to have to worry about blue and black, specifically cards like Watery Grave, Underground River, and Drowned Catacomb. Those are the really big name ones that you have to worry about. There's a few minor ones as well, and there's also some utility lands like Lonely Sandbar, which instead of just coming in as a land, you can actually tap 1 blue to cycle it, which is you discarding it and then drawing another card. It's just another way of trying to get as many cards as you want out of your deck as possible, with only 1 copy of any card at a given time. So, EDH is one of those decks where a lot of creativity comes out, and you have the opportunity to use a lot of cards that work together that weren't necessarily printed around the same time, so you didn't get a chance to see them how they work together. But a deck like this definitely loves to play around with things, and because this is random jank, I use a lot of cards that not a lot of people used when they were around to use them. Specifically, a set of 3 cards that allow you to use just about every single one of your opponent's creatures. It starts off with Grave Pact. Anytime you lose one of your creatures, your opponent has to sacrifice a creature. Second card is Call to the Grave. Now, during each of your opponent's upkeeps, they have to sacrifice a non-zombie creature. Now, the last card is Grave Betrayal. Notice how all 3 of these cards have grave in it? I think they might have planned something like this on their own. Grave Betrayal is a very expensive enchantment that anytime your opponent loses a creature, they come back onto the battlefield under your control as a zombie. So it's no longer being affected by the Call to the Grave. They have to sacrifice a creature anytime that you lose a creature, and then you get back whatever creature they had to sacrifice as a zombie so that you don't have to lose anything ever again. All of these 3 cards, in my opinion, work very well with the next card I'm about to talk about, Endless Ranks of the Dead. During every single one of your upkeeps, Endless Ranks of the Dead looks at how many zombies that you have, and it puts half again as many zombies back onto the battlefield. Hypothetically speaking, you have 10 zombies out. Endless Ranks of the Dead is going to see that you have 10, and you're going to get 5 brand new ones for absolutely no cost at all. Okay, well, it costs to bring out the card, but other than that, it's pretty much free. So, when you have all of these cards coming out, you need a way of consistently making your opponent sacrifice creatures that you want. Grave Pact is good, Call to the Grave is okay too, but if your opponent is also playing zombies, you're not going to be able to take those creatures out for yourself. And that is one of the reasons, amongst others, why I included Eldrazi Monument. Now, it's a fantastic artifact, and the only downside is that every single turn you have to sacrifice a creature. But when you hit Call to the Grave, it's no longer a big issue, because every time you sacrifice a creature, your opponent is sacrificing a creature. And then with Grave Betrayal out, any creature that your opponent sacrifices, you're getting back. So at the end of the day, you're not actually losing any creatures, and you can sacrifice one of the tokens that Endless Ranks of the Dead creates, so you're not losing any useful creatures out of it. Sacrifice a token, your opponent has to sacrifice a creature that you then get back, keeping the exact same board position, if not even better board position, because they had to sacrifice a creature that was probably really, really useful to their plan. Now, with all these zombies coming out, I like the theme of zombie apocalypse, where basically there is nothing left on the field but zombies. In EDH, there's a lot of creatures that are going to be coming out at the same time. Your opponents all are going to be trying to do either something like this or very similar to try and stop you from being able to pull off the exact same thing. Now, the easiest way of trying to eliminate your opponent's plans is just to wipe the board clean. Now, instead of just flipping over the table and restarting the game from scratch and having all of your friends hate you, the best way to do this is to have some kind of board wipe where you're actually destroying all of your opponent's creatures at the same time. Not only will that work well with the other enchantments that I talked about, but there's a way to do it without you actually losing your creatures yourself. You keep Endless Ranks of the Dead in, and then you add Noxious Ghoul. Now what Noxious Ghoul does is every time a zombie creature comes into play, all non-zombie creatures get -1/-1 until the end of the turn. With Endless Ranks of the Dead out, and all the zombie tokens that you're planning on making with that, bunch of zombies are going to be coming into play at the same time. All of your opponent's non-zombie creatures are going to get really, really small, really, really fast, and even if they do happen to survive, they're going to be a lot less of a threat to you. And if they don't survive, chances are you just got some benefit out of it because you got their creatures instead. One of the best benefits of Eldrazi Monument is that it makes all of your creatures indestructible, which makes things like board wipes a lot less destructive on your end, which is why I felt very free to include a few of my own. Damnation is the big one. It's one of the cheaper ones that you can have in a black or blue deck, specifically black because it's a black card. And it destroys all creatures without having them have the ability to regenerate. It's essentially Wrath of God, except in a better color for creature destruction. Since all of your creatures are indestructible, you're not losing anything. And if you have those enchantments that I was talking about before, massive payoff for having a 4-cost sorcery. Destroy pretty much everything else on the field, except for your stuff. Now, there are times when you're not going to have everything out in play. Don't be afraid to be able to play other board wipes, specifically things like Mutilate. Mutilate is one of those cards where it gives -1/-1 to every single creature on the field based on the number of swamps that you have. It is going to go around indestructibility and it will affect your zombies, but there are some times where your opponent's board position are better than yours and you want to be able to reset the game without fully resetting the game. That's one of the ways to do it. My favorite board wipe right now, besides Damnation and besides my Noxious Ghoul combo, is Life's Finale. It also does a damnation effect where everything gets destroyed, but then you get to take a look at one of your opponent's libraries and remove 3 of those creatures and also put those into the grave. Very useful if you know that your opponent has a deck that has a lot of big, powerful creatures. You don't necessarily know what they have, so you're getting information on their deck at the same time, and they just lost 3 creatures that they might have been able to cast at a later time. So I've talked about a lot of different cards that are in this deck, but the one thing I haven't really talked about is the general himself, Grimgrin. Now, what I tried to do is I tried to build a very specific sacrifice engine out of Grimgrin. Not only that, but I included a couple of other creatures into the deck that allow you to sacrifice other creatures to be able to activate this very specific thing. We're going to start off with Grimgrin. We're going to assume that he's already on the field. Now, the main crux of this combo is Gravecrawler. It's a 1-drop, 2/1. It can't block, but as long as you have a zombie on the field, which with this deck I don't think is going to be much of a problem, you can cast it back from the grave for its exact same mana cost. Now, on top of that, there's Diregraph Captain, the main reason why I have blue in this deck besides for the general himself. It's a 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 black mana. It's a 2/2 Lord, and what a Lord is a creature that uses its same creature type and powers up other creatures of the same creature type. In this case, it's Zombie. It gives all of your zombies +1/+1 permanently, and whenever a zombie creature dies, your opponent loses a life. Now, I'm sure you already see where I'm going with this. You sacrifice Gravecrawler to Grimgrin so that he can get a +1/+1 counter. Your opponent is going to have to lose a life. Gravecrawler's in the grave, but you already have zombies out, and then you can just recast it, and keep doing that over and over again for as long as you have mana. However, what if you can do that infinitely, without having to worry about your mana? That's why I included Rooftop Storm. It's a 6 mana cost blue enchantment that make all of your zombie creatures free to cast. Now, it's not going to affect your general, because your general comes out a different way than your normal cards. It doesn't actually start off in your deck. It starts off in a separate pile, and I will be talking about that in just a moment. Now, you have Rooftop Storm out, you have your Infinite Sack engine, and as long as you have Diregraph Captain out, one of your opponents is losing a life every single turn. So you don't even have to worry about attacking people at that point. As long as you have those 4 creatures out, you're constantly sacking Gravecrawler, bringing him back into the battlefield for free, and then sacrificing him again to Grimgrin, or one of your other sack engines that are going to be in the deck. And thanks to Diregraph Captain, your opponents are going to be losing a life every single turn. It's a very painful way to lose the game. I've actually lost games myself to this infinite combo. It's very painful and very embarrassing. So in EDH, your general is the guy that's really the main crux of the entire thing. Your deck is already limited in the types of cards that it can have based on its colors, and most people try to build a deck based around that general as much as possible. As you've already seen, I have a lot of zombie creatures in the deck and a few sacrifice engines to really beef up Grimgrin as much as possible. The cool thing about your general that you choose for your deck is that you can actually recast him. If he dies or if something happens where you have to shuffle him back into your library for any reason whatsoever, you can actually choose not to do that. Instead, he goes back into his commander section. And what happens from there is that you have to repay the casting cost to have him back into play. Now, the downside to this is that his casting cost just went up by 2 every time that you have to do this. So Grimgrin starts off at 5. If he dies at any point, to recast him, it's going to cost 7. If it happens again, it's going to cost you 9, and so on and so forth until the game is over, one way or another. You see my infinite combo, you see some of the cards that I'm using to kind of bring that card out. But that's actually not the main theme of my deck. That's just the extra stuff to help bring out this main theme. Blue is one of my favorite colors, not just because it has a lot of counterspells and a lot of control elements, but because of one of my favorite non-evergreen mechanics in the game, milling. Taking your opponent's top card of the deck and putting it onto the bottom of his grave. Now, I love milling. I've tried to make decks with mill as much as possible. This is no different. We're going to start off with Undead Alchemist. It's a 4/2 creature. Anytime one of your zombies deals damage to your opponent, instead of dealing damage, he will actually mill as much damage as that would be. And then anytime a creature gets hit with this, they have to exile that creature, and then you get a 2/2 zombie out of it. More zombie army. Now on top of that, by exiling that card, if your opponent is playing a deck that would actually be able to bring creatures back from the grave onto the battlefield, they can no longer do that because the creature card just got exiled. So you're not only stopping your opponent's plan or potential plan, but you're helping benefit yourself as much as you are hurting them. Now, there are a lot of other cards that you can use for mill. Some of my favorite ones include Increasing Confusion, a 1 blue mana X spell with flashback for the exact same mana cost, where you double the amount of mill every time that you use flashback on it. It's one of my favorite cards that you've already seen in my Trollkeeper to Nothingness deck. Yes, I am shamelessly plugging my own videos. Now, on top of that, I actually discovered a much better card. I'm still going to have Increasing Confusion in there, but I'm also going to include Mind Grind. It costs 1 black on top of the blue and X. Instead of just milling X, they're milling X lands. So let's say you have 10 mana out. 1 blue, 1 black, 8 of anything. You tap it all out. Your opponent has to mill 8 lands. But they're constantly milling cards anyways, so they only stop milling once they hit 8 lands. It might take them 20 cards in the deck to mill 8 lands. With every one of those cards that get milled, Undead Alchemist is helping you by getting more zombie creatures out, because the milling doesn't just happen, or the creatures that you get from milling doesn't just happen because you're doing damage, it also happens when you're just doing general mill. Very useful. And the final card that I'm going to be talking about, which is one of the more unorthodox mill cards, is Traumatize. It's a 5 mana cost sorcery. Your target opponent has to mill half of his deck into the grave. Now, if you've already seen what Undead Alchemist can do with just normal 1 or 2 or 3 card mills, imagine how many zombie tokens you're going to be getting when he mills half of his deck into his grave. Unless he's playing one of those freaky decks that have absolutely no creatures in it at all, you're getting a lot of zombie tokens for 5 mana. And what better way to end a video on a channel called Random Jank than with a bunch of cards that chances are not a lot of people have used. EDH, again, is one of my favorite formats. It allows you to use cards that nobody really used at the time when they were released, but seem a lot better when you have the opportunity to use them. Feel free to like and subscribe to this video if you want to see more, and share this with all your friends because I'm lonely. I'll see you next Friday. There's only 2 left, and we're going to start off with one of my favorite guilds of all time, Selesnya. Now, this guild is the green and white guild. Their keyword is populate. Now, what it does is it creates... Today is no different. We're going to start off with Azorius. Azorius' keyword is detain. Now, what it is that it causes target opponent's creatures to neither be able to attack